and start. I I am not the best writer in the world, but I hope that my emails communicated kind of this what we're going to be doing in terms of the live streams. I don't know tech, but they cut off the last couple of classes midstream. Got students check and they said, well, the live was still going, but it apparently wasn't recording. So I'm just going to record directly to my computer and upload it after. So just in the future, if you're looking for the live stream, it'll be posted like right after class. Okay. All right. This is going to be fun. I'm hoping that after today, we are feeling confident. We're feeling comfortable going into our first exam. The past week, I've been thinking of analogies and different ways to try to explain what I'm trying to explain. And if you're feeling a little frustrated right now or this week, that's okay. This is a new way of looking at things than what you're traditionally used to. But just know that after this first test, it's not that we start over from scratch. It's the same concepts: position, motion, change in position, looking at joints locally, not globally. And we're just going to apply it to new places. Okay. So this is kind of the toughest test because you're learning the rules of the game. And yeah, with rules comes verbiage and things you got to kind of memorize. But the fun part of the game is playing the game, learning how to play the game. And the more you play, the better you're going to get at the game of human movement. Okay. All right. So I thought about this analogy. Even though I mention it, I need to do a better job of developing so that you guys can master these concepts. One of the limitations of this anatomical position of planes and axes is that it doesn't show you all the planes and axes of every individual joint. Like it just shows you just one. And I think I mentioned it in class. That would be like saying if the whole body was spinning. But unless you are Harry Potter or possessed, I don't think you're just going to start spinning around, right? Or a combination, Voldemort, Horcruxes, right? I guess you could comment, Harry Potter humor at 7:30 in the morning. So I thought of how can I best explain this concept? And I came up with something that I hope works for everybody. You want a Rubik's Cube. Now, a Rubik's Cube is one block. Like the whole thing is one block, but it's made up of several individual blocks within a block. All right, so far so bad. Now, the one on the left is in anatomical position. They're all lined up. I can say the white is on the top, posterior, the whatever color, let's assume orange is inferior, maybe blue is anterior, and red is well, this is only one block. So the right side, the left side. I can identify things because they're all lined up. But the whole block, me, is made up of independent blocks, the joints. Now, what do we know about a Rubik's Cube? You can mix it up. They don't have to stay in order. You can mix it up. Our bodies we can mix it up. We can do a lot of weird things. I could just move the right block. I could just move the left. I could move both. Right? I can mix up the blocks. They don't have to stay in anatomical position. But here's the lesson that I'm hoping we can understand today. If I establish that in anatomical position, the blue is in the front, it's anterior, that means if I see on the right, when I mix things up, the blue might be on the top of the cube, but those are still anterior squares. Let me give you an example. If I establish that in anatomical position, the front part of my hand, the anterior part of my hand, right? That would be like a blue square. Okay? If I do this, see, the light bulbs go off. If I take a blue square and flip it 180 and now the blue is facing the back, It might be facing the back of the whole cube, but that's still a front square. This is still the anterior part of my hand. It doesn't change. It doesn't make the anterior become my posterior. All the structures, all the veins, all the vessels, all the muscles, all the bones are still in the front, even though my front might become my body's back. Make sense? My fingernails are in the back or in the posterior when I'm standing in anatomical position. But I can rearrange my Rubik's Cube to make my fingernails face in the front. Does that mean that my fingernails are anterior? Do you see what I'm getting at? And this lesson comes when we mix up our Rubik's Cube. We may have joint motion that might look lateral, away from the midline, close to midline. But it's not about the whole Rubik's Cube. It's about those individual cubes within the cube. So when you see flexion and extension, this isn't, well, he's going away from the midline, must be abduction, or he's going towards the midline, must be abduction. This is still the anterior part. This is still the bilateral axis. This is still the bilateral axis. This is still the anterior part. This is still flexion and extension. Flexion of the wrist towards anatomical. Extension of the wrist away from, flexion of the wrist towards fetal. Extension of the wrist away from fetal. I shift my Rubik's Cube. This is still flexion of my wrist. This still got me more into fetal of this cube, of this block within the block. It's not about the whole Rubik's Cube. That's called your body. What I'm trying to focus on are the individual cubes within the big cube. And that's local. That's locally based, okay? Does that make more sense? All right, next up, I'd like to go into more detail. Well, use the file. Not the file. Yay. All right, this is what I want to go into more detail. Right here. So, flexion, motion getting you more into fetal, but not your whole body. You could just get each individual joint more into fetal. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. It doesn't have to be. Flexion is only when everything moves. Extension getting further away. I know your instinct is to, well, I remember in a freshman level kinesiology, they said something about angles. And I'm not saying that's not true because joints have rotation and rotation is angles. But we have to establish which angles. And I think I gave an example of that. Because if I decrease this one, guess which one increases? Yeah, the other one. And if I decrease this one, guess what? It increases the other one. So we have to be clear. So what I'm going to try to do today for this lecture is emphasize in layman's terms which areas are getting closer to each other when I do go in the field. And I think honestly, a lot of this stuff should kind of be common sense, but we do not assume in this class. There's a lot of things my wife says, well, that's common sense. And I'm like, right? So I'm not going to assume. Let's start with the cervical. For your cervical vertebra, flexion of your cervical vertebra, getting in the fetal, is going to be when your chin gets closer to your chest, right? This anterior, the front angle. But it's not even about, remember, I don't like angles because that's so global. Angles is so global. Chin to chest gets you more into a ball. Or chest to chin, right? So it doesn't have to be the chin to the chest. I can get into flexion or fetal by moving my chest to my chin. Think of it like this. Yoink. This is my neck. Okay. Flexion, chin to chest. But I could also have the same curve, the same bend by doing this. It gets me to the same place. Here to there, is the same as from there to there. It gets me the same curve. Make sense? Now you have the same bend whether I move the top part or whether I move the bottom part. You get the same curve. Okay? It's the same bend. Now, what's tough about angles, again, is as you decrease one, you increase another, so it gets confusing. So when my chin gets further away from my chest, or, you could say the back of your skull. I don't like the back of the skull because there's no prominent structure up there to see. Does that make sense? Like it's just, except on mine, and I got some skin. But the chin is a great landmark. So if the chin gets further away from the chest, that gets you further away from fetal, that's going to be extension. So think about it. It follows the same rules. If I'm all the way into fetal, I'm as flexed as I can. Extension got me further away. My chin's getting further away from my chest, further away, further away, further away, further away, further away, further away, further away. So I had extension the entire time. Chin gets closer to, closer to, closer to, closer to, closer to, closer to, closer to. I had flexion the entire time. And then we talked about the nuance. I could have chin could get closer to my chest from anatomical. Chin could get further away from my chest from anatomical. Chin could get closer to my chest to anatomical. Chin could get closer to my chest from anatomical. Flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to. It's practice. It's practice. Like learning what was from The Sound of Music? Do, re, mi, la, lo, fa, sol. It's practice. And that's what I'm expecting you guys to do on your own time, is practice these things. Think of it from a sports analogy. Anybody in fantasy football? I had to retire, I was driving me crazy. But you have, and I guess this applies at soccer, softball, any sport. You have a game plan for the week for the team you're playing. But you do it in installments. You don't put everything right away. You install the plan and then you practice it. And you do a walkthrough. You know what our walkthrough is? It's Monday. Monday's our walkthrough. Make sure, team, do we have any questions? Any clarifications? Last minute tune-ups? But we're installing the game plan for your first test. Your first test is game day. Okay? Any questions about this? And eventually we're going to get into, no problem, right ear, right shoulder, left ear, left shoulder, right? We're going to use local landmarks. But you know what we're not going to use? Global landmarks. We're not going to say extension is when you look up. Because I could have extension and not necessarily look up. I could be up, I could have extension and look down. It has nothing to do with up, down, right, left. Keep it local, keep it within house. Keep the cubes within the cube. Okay? Trunk, flexion, and extension. No problem. Sternum, part of your rib, in the middle of your ribs, and your pubis, which is in the middle of your pelvis. Inside landmarks, cubes within a cube. It's all meant to happen. If it happens, it's meant to happen. So look, instead of doing chin to chest, all we're doing is working it down and saying sternum to pubis. Because that's where these vertebrae, that's where this slinky lies. In fact, a lot of muscles that we're going to learn about in biomechanics are yanking on these ribs so that they can move your slinky. All right. And they're anchoring from the pelvis and going up and reaching over those ribs and pulling on these ribs. So think about it. Boom, boom. Boom, boom. That's the actual sound that my back makes for getting old. So cracking, booming, boomer. That's what my sons call me. But we're doing this. But this is not flexion. If I keep my back straight, So in other words, it's not about sternum looks at the ground. That has nothing to do with it. It's, does the sternum get closer to my pelvis? That's what's going to get me more into a ball. If the spine stays straight and I do this, I didn't curve with the spine. I didn't get more in the fetal. Does that make sense? It has nothing to do with the chest to the ground or the chest to the ceiling or the chest to the floor. It's about the chest to your pelvis. And if you have curve, that's flexion. Closer to. Further away, extension, because I'm getting further and away from fetal. You're not going to do this. Hey, watch out. Oh, I got to get in the fetal. You get to a ball. Is that making more sense? Now, again, why don't I use things like decrease angles? Because every time you decrease one angle, you increase another, and that gets confusing. Some are in the front, some in the back, especially when we get into laterals. That doesn't make sense. When we get into transverse, especially, that makes no sense. But we can use local landmarks. Okay? Does everybody understand? Flexion from, extension to, extension from, flexion to. Well, Campbell, why don't you say hyper? Hyper is excessive. Hyper is beyond normal. If you have normal extension from anatomical, how's that hyper? It's normal road. Is this helping? Yes. Okay. You want to keep rolling? Oh, question. What you got? Absolutely. We're going to do the hip and the knee. I'm literally trying to go down. You be you. And I love it. And I love it. That the hip is hard. We're going to make it easy. You're going to make it easy. All right, guys. Shoulder. Yeah, yeah. It's not a silly question, I promise. All right, it's a silly question. I'm joking. Yes. Oh God, yeah. Well, what a great clarification. That was not a silly question at all. It was not. Any joint, because remember, at bourgeois, that door will always move about the wall. In our Rubik's Cube, we can move walls about doors. We name them because the small piece usually moves about the big piece. But the big piece can move about the small piece, and it's all about relative change in motion. So absolutely. What would that look like? It would look something, well, I'm going to give you some examples. It would look like this. Smaller piece moving about the big piece. Big piece moving about the small piece. Or, for a more practical example, yeah, like doing reverse, why do you think they call it reverse crunch? It's still a crunch. Yeah. Yeah, it's still a crunch, but instead of doing chest going to pubis, all you're doing is doing pubis to chest. It's the same thing. I was thinking about and the Lord said, it's the same thing. Hey, one of my favorite movies. And listen, forgive my lack of youth. But what we're saying is that from here to there is the same as from here to there. Flexion, extension, flexion, extension. Now, I'm talking about the trunk. Your hips did something. This ain't about the hips right now. We'll get to the hips when we get to the hips. Make sense? How many of you are familiar with one of the greatest movies ever made? There's a lot. No. There's only one. And it involves Eddie Murphy. Yes! That is the correct answer. And he's like, just taste the soup. He's like, well, I gotta taste the soup. He's like, just taste the soup. He's like, all right, where's the spoon? Aha! Aha! Kermit the Frog here. All right, where was I at? Getting some ice from my back. So yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. Guys, we're in this together. We're a team. I may not remember because again, I don't read from slides. So call me. Hey, would that work the same? Yes, thank you so much. So shoulder. First, I'm going to actually work in the hip. Shoulder and the hip are the same exact type of joint, just in different places. They're two sockets, lower extremities versions, upper extremities versions. One of the reasons it gets confusing is because I need more stability here. Because if I dislocate my hip in our ancestors' days, I'm going to die. I mean, I'm serious. Like if there's, now we live in a world but if I lived like 500 years ago and I broke my hip, they'd be like, listen, thank you for all your service, but we have to continue to migrate. I mean, we put a lot of effort to stabilize our hips. Shoulders, I could pop this out of place and still run away from danger. You see what I'm saying? I have to have more motion here, but they're the same type of joint. So what will get me in the fetal? If my Rubik's Cube is all lined up, front part of my arm getting closer to the front part of my shoulder. Technically, it's your collarbone. Let's call it your collarbone. Humerus gets closer to collarbone. Because I know that if I want to get into a ball, I need to protect my head, and I'm not going to do that like this. So if I freeze my shoulders and bring everything back, if I fix the Rubik's Cube except for one little piece, you're going to see that my shoulders are flexed. Same as my hips. I don't think we have a problem with identifying that this is hip flexion, right? Getting into a ball. Well, why wouldn't this be shoulder flexion? Sense? Okay. So it still fits the same mold, getting you in the fetal. So front gets closer to top in flexion. Front gets further away from top in extension. If you want to use landmarks, I think a collarbone is a great landmark, right? Your clavicle, closer to your clavicle when you get in the fetal, further away from your clavicle when you get into extension. I have no problem with using those landmarks. Guys, ESPN's been lying to you. When they say full extension, that's not the shoulder. Now, they may be referencing the elbow and not realizing it, right? My elbow's fully extended, but my elbow was fully extended probably when I was in the outfield. The shoulder flexion is what's going to allow me to get into that new position, catch the ball. So, for shoulders.
So you're saying that like this is the same thing as this? Like
For your shoulder?
Yeah.
Your shoulder position does not change. Now, I'm creating a question. Clarify me if it's not the right question. You have the exact same shoulder position, regardless of what you're doing here or here. My shoulders are flexed at 90 degrees. They're still flexed at 90 degrees. My shoulders are still flexed at 90 degrees. My shoulders are still flexed at 90 degrees. My shoulders are still flexed at 90 degrees.
So if you just make a little bit, like just making this.
Exactly. Because the shoulder joint is made up of the humerus and the glenoid fossa of the scapula. Yeah. It has nothing to do with any of this stuff. This is all just distraction. Illusions. It looks like it's moving, and it is. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. Aha! New position. Everybody get that? Anatomical. More in the fetal. So I had to have flexion to get it. And the reason it messes with some students is because your instinct is to want to make it about the root. Your instinct is want to make, well, the arms still stay parallel. Parallel to what? Gravity? Gravity doesn't have anything to do with my joint motions. Gravity doesn't have anything to do with that Rubik's Cube. I drop it, it's still going to be the cube. The only way I'm going to move it is if I literally move pieces within the cube. Make sense? So do not use terms like arm go forward, arm go back. That's primitive caveman talk in this analogy. I don't want you to say, well, arm went back, and say that was shoulder extension. My arm might have went back globally, but my shoulder didn't change position. Does that make sense? My shoulder stayed, my left shoulder stayed in its anatomy, my left. All right, because I'm getting old and I need balance. All right, did we check off the shoulder box? Okay, let's go to the elbow box. Question? Good. Elbow box. Flexion, getting in the fetal, is going to be when the anterior part of my forearm gets closer to the anterior part of my upper arm. More specifically, ulna gets closer to humerus. But what I don't want to do is I don't want to use landmarks like hands and fingers, because again, I can do this. I can really manipulate these distal segments. Does that make sense? So elbow flexion, getting me into fetal. Elbow extension, getting me further out. But again, I could take my Rubik's Cube and move it in a lot of different parts. I can have flexion that looks like this. That's bilateral elbow flexion. This is bilateral elbow extension. Does that make sense? My elbows did the exact same thing. If I reposition the other pieces of the Rubik's Cube, you'll see that I'm in the exact same position for my right elbow. True or false? My right and left elbow are both flexed roughly 90 degrees. I'm trying my best. My right elbow is still flexed 90 degrees. 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 So again, it has nothing to do with hands going up or down. It has everything to do with the cubes within the cube, the joints themselves. Bicep, anterior part of the upper arm, gets further away from the anterior part of the lower arm. I'm just trying to use landmarks. If fetal and out of fetal isn't working for you. But what I do not like to use is angles, because angles are absolute. Angles are global. Angles can get us into trouble. If we keep it within the cube and say this piece gets closer to that piece, I'm okay with that. The main thing is I need you guys to make sure you understand is that for my right elbow, this has nothing to do with getting closer or further away from the midline. Nothing to do with it. My right elbow is getting more into fetal. My right elbow is getting further away from fetal.
All it says, we'll have to explain, not to say elbow flexion, but I would say because like explain why, because all is closer to the humerus or.
I just want you to.
You know?
I'm looking for. Oh, I want you to understand position of joints and I want you to understand motion of joints. How you get those things, that's up to you. I'm never going to ask you a question about a Rubik's Cube. I'm going to use the Rubik's Cube to try to explain and better develop the concepts, but all of the questions are going to come back to what's the position of my right elbow? My right elbow is flexed. What's the change in position of my right elbow? My elbow is extending. My right elbow is extending. What's the position of my right wrist? It's flexed. What's the position of my right wrist? It's extended. What motion change did you see from here to here? That was right wrist flexion to anatomical. Right wrist flexion from anatomical. It's always going to come back to what I'm trying to develop, and that's the concepts of joint position and joint motion, joint by joint by joint by joint. That's it. If I'm asking you about the right shoulder, I might move every single thing in the body. But if I'm asking you about the right shoulder, it don't matter what my brother's doing. It doesn't matter what my sister and my cousin's doing. I'm looking here. And did I have a change in that position right here? Wrist, anatomical position. So watch this. I thought of this analogy. The wrist doesn't twist, you guys. My radial ulnar joint twists, but the wrist doesn't twist. So when I'm in anatomical, notice how my left finger, anterior and anterior. Anterior and anterior. Does that make sense? So you can look at it a lot of different ways, but the palm of your hand is always going to be anterior. And the anterior part of your forearm is always going to line up with your palm. That's why I say follow the fingers. The fingers will show you the wrist flexion. Follow the fingers. Like a party favor where you blow it and it rolls back. Follow the fingers. So when the anterior part of your palm gets closer to the anterior part of your distal forearm, that's going to get you in the fetal position for the wrist. But again, a cheat sheet is just follow the fingers. The fingers will show you the flexion. So when anterior, the front, gets further away from the front, it's extension. And when the front gets closer to the front, that's flexion. Now, you might be saying, well, Campbell, why don't you just say front to front for all of them? Because the knee didn't work like that. The knee was back to back, right? It doesn't necessarily work globally. Going to the illusions. So front to front. So that could mean this is flexion. That could mean this is extension. More specifically, like if you're doing push-ups, right? I'm in an extended position when I'm here. And I think most students might miss that question because they say, well, I thought flexion was when the fingers go forward. I'm like, it has nothing to do with that. If I lost all my fingers in a tragic sawmill accident, I can still flex and extend my wrist. Nothing to do with fingers. So where students miss it is they'll say, well, I thought fingers go forward as flexion. Follow the fingers to flexion. Make sense? Flexion, extension could look like this. Extension, flexion. It could look like this, extension, flexion. It could look like this, extension, flexion. It can look like this. They don't have to do the same thing. My left wrist had flexion, my right wrist had extension. My right wrist had flexion, my left wrist had extension. So again, globally, you may look at it as they're doing the same thing, like windshield wipers. They're not. The left went into fetal, the right went out. Sense? All right, hips and knees. Hips and knees. Landmarks. So for my femur, the anterior part of my femur is getting closer to my pelvis. In anatomical or anatomy lab, y'all learn like anterior and inferior superior iliac spines. It's on the pelvis. It's on the pelvis. That's like saying the ship is coming in east from Hawaii because it's getting closer to Des Moines, Iowa. It's getting closer to America. So the pelvis is like a continent, and then we have little cities, little landmarks within. So fetal position, flexion is going to get you closer to fetal. Anterior part gets closer to the pelvis, just like for the shoulder, the anterior part got closer to the cloud. Okay. The illusion stuff. So that all that's saying is that, well, if flexion is just that change in those two different segments, I could also have flexion by bringing my pelvis closer to the anterior part of my femur. Femur, anterior part of my femur gets closer to my pelvis, or my pelvis gets closer to the anterior part of my femur. And what I just did was just simply this. It's just, Ken is a lot more rigid. Flexion, left hip flexion, left hip flexion. That's all that is. Because I'm in the exact same new position. Left hip flexion, left hip extension. Left hip flexion, left hip extension. But you know what isn't motion? What's happening at the right hip? This had no motion in it. Still in the same position. Yeah, exactly. But if you go based off of leg goes back, leg goes forward, this goes up and down, you might get it wrong. Well, I thought extension was when leg goes back. No. Did this hip get closer or further away from fetal? No. In other words, I love this analogy. I could put a cast, or in Ken's case, I could super glue this hip. I could super glue it where it wouldn't move if I tried. I could still do this. You get it? You can still do that because there was no motion here. So to me, this summarizes the two biggest illusions of human motion. It looks like it's moving and it's not, right here. And it looks like it's not moving, but it is, left hip. Everybody get that? It looks like it's moving, but it's not. It looks like it's not moving, but it is. I get some, and I understand. I get a lot of flack sometimes for not using a traditional textbook. I get it. Not only are traditional textbooks expensive, the textbook companies, do you think they're trying to help further students' educations because they care? What are they trying to do? Make money. And so they're compressing a lot of different subject matters into one book so they can pitch it to several classes. If you go into a traditional textbook, the only examples you're going to see is it looks like it's moving and it is. You're going to see these. But you know what you're not going to see? And you're not going to have people explain this. You're not going to have people explain that. All you're going to see in a basic textbook is this with no nuance. No, well, this applies to every individual joint, and each joint has potential for planes and axes, and this is why there's so many different things called flexion, because they're all trying to get you into fetal and out of fetal, and flexion could look like this, but it could also look like this, and it could look like, you know what you're gonna get? And that's okay for introductory level classes. This ain't the minor leagues, ladies and gentlemen. Let this be for people who are not upper level kinesiology majors in our program. Human movement, there's a lot of freaky stuff that happens in human movement, especially because it happens so fast. Some of you are going to need to be able to see movement for helping someone get better, helping them improve. How can you help them improve if you can't see what's really happening inside the body? Some of you are going to have to see movement to understand mechanisms of injury. How did it happen? What position was the body in when you got hurt? You can't really do that well if all you've ever been introduced to is basic motion. Textbooks will show you this. Textbooks will not show you this. But you know who will? This guy. This guy. We do it, not that it's easy. We do it because it's hard. But I promise you, it will become easy. You weren't born on this earth and all of a sudden just walking like this. It took time. It took time to be able to feed yourself. It took time for you to be able to run. It took time for you to be able to skate. It took time for you to be able to swing a bat. It took time for you to be able to shoot a ball. It takes time. So the lesson on you guys is, well, we don't have a lot of time. Well, you have the time that you have. And so what a great time to go into the weekend and practice your free throws. What a great time to go into the weekend and take some extra cuts. What a great time to go into the weekend and practice human movement. Guys, if you're awake, you can be practicing. Open the cabinet. What did my elbow do? I'm cooking dinner. What did my elbow do? And I know sometimes you're like, well, I'm not quite sure. Don't worry about that. Answer what you can answer. Practice what you can practice. Give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. All right? Y'all have a great weekend, guys. Go Cajuns.